So, welcome, Peter P. We're about to talk about the difference between the German and the English corner, and that's why we're going to have this conversation in English, though we're both two German native speakers. You just recently published, or you were part of a conversation with Neil. I had a
Of course.
conversation with Neil, and Paul Venderkley today published a new video, um, which Chad also cited already, and you know what I mean, the part about metamodernism and Orthodox and the way
Mhm.
the Orthodox propose their narratives in this little corner of the internet.
Which is
Uh,
quite
what
amazing
what
because
Sam Tiedemann commented on
yeah,
when he was talking with uh, Brendan Dempsey, I think is his name.
mm,
So maybe you want to start and just give your comment about what you saw there and how you would situate that in this discussion.
I think as usual, people take a great many things for granted. And what really makes it distinct, or the experience of the different corners of the different waters, so to speak, in the estuary, if you like, is really you go another place and then you react to it because you see something for you that is unusual. And the Orthodox, for example, we have that video by Paul Vennerkla, I think it's maybe 1 or 2 weeks old, and he says, are they one of the most popular and real options within the corner? And the question for a German fellow would be, popular within Germany? In our country? Nothing like it. There is almost, I think, no Orthodox church, and we do have a few growing up. We do have a few fellows who are very interested in this, and I think we shouldn't hesitate to say of them that they are the Orthobros. There are a few distinct people who are very interested, and they form, in our very little and small German language chat, another distinct community and minority. But I think minority within a minority, it speaks for itself. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
we are, of
So
course,
what you
much
could say
more.
is there's a history in Germany that actually precludes the existence of a large Orthodox church on German
Yeah.
soil,
And even,
primarily due to the driving forces of state churchism and the predominant two uh, mainline churches, Catholicism and Protestantism, and
and even,
not even the Protestantism that you would think of when you think about Protestantism in the US, but it's basically only the difference between the Protestant state church in its Lutheran uh, specialization or in its rather Zwinglian or unionized specialization. And so you have within the Protestant state church only two to three different theological approaches, let's say.
mm,
And you have the Catholic Church, and then you have a huge gap until you reach the minorities of the evangelical churches. And even within those, there are huge gaps between the Baptist and the Pentecostal ones. And even way down further, you have the German Orthodox community. Now, you
and
do have, especially from the Russian imports, the so-called Spätaussiedler, uh, those with German heritage that still today can actually become German citizens um, if they have, proof of their heritage and have uh, been born in the former Soviet Union. They can still be part of the German society, and they are predominantly Orthodox in some way. And so
and
when we talk about Orthodoxy in Germany, we are talking about a predominantly Russian Orthodox community with small splinters of Serbian Orthodoxy and Armenian Orthodoxy. But mostly those are imports by former refugees.
by the way, Jewish Orthodoxy is the same. That means when we look at the former DDR, that is um, the former Soviet Union, and so Germany is obviously split or was split.
Yes,
And it is
yes,
in so
yeah,
far split still nowadays, as the population or the former population is different than it is nowadays. And of course, we have a new generation coming up, and so they are living not so much with the consciousness of there are two sides in Germany, but it is still there. I have been living in the northern part of Germany, that is Schleswig-Holstein. I have been living in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and I can say that again, the Jewish Orthodox are the returning people from other countries. They are not the Jews from that
yes,
region or the German part of it. They are from other places. White Russia, for example, in Rostock is one of the communities that I know of, and so this kind of orthodoxy is also not that prominent. And we shouldn't be so much focused on the Christian stuff, because of when someone like Paul Vanderklay comes to Europe, he often says, "Oh, there is everywhere Christendom. It's breathing. It's full of that." But in the
yeah. That's
proposition he
I found
puts
that quite
forward in the
astonishing that he
document,
said that.
yes, and that he says it is astonishing, and that the people are no longer acting upon it. They are no longer going to church. They are not
Yes,
really propositionally believing in it. And when people have something like an evangelical belief, that is a Protestant belief, that's almost nothing. It's almost
yes,
nothing. It
yes.
has no role in their life whatsoever. So,
Now I have to look something up because I actually have numbers for that, and I hope you can still see me while I'm trying to do that here because I'm
I can
working on
still
my
see you, but
smartphone.
you are,
I'm the wrong way up, so I need to do this right now probably.
yeah,
Um,
you might want to break your neck if you want to return to your former position.
yeah, that's the trouble of being on a business trip without having your laptop with you. But I do have numbers actually on this, which I think are important to the conversation. Now, the average church attendant in Germany goes to church at least once a week in 4 weeks out of 52 weeks per year, which basically means they go to church on Easter and on Christmas, and that's it.
Yes.
In Eastern Germany, the birth years of 1986 onwards, studies show they are stable NONES, none.
I'm listening, but I'm not hearing you. Stefan?
Yeah, so I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back
Okay.
again.
So just to clarify those numbers, 2/3 in Eastern Germany do not ascribe to any denomination.
Yes, and
Whereas
that's the
in
group, the
whereas in
nones.
unified Germany, that's only 35%.
Mm, mm,
52% of Germans still ascribe to Christianity, but that is a huge difference between East and West.
indeed.
There is basically the split between the Iron Curtain, the former Iron Curtain, is the split between a predominantly atheist, rationalist, materialist society in Eastern Germany and a still somewhat Christianized society in Western Germany,
And
which
even
makes
there,
up
there's
the
a difference
total.
between the northern and the southern parts and the ones
Yes,
in the
yes,
middle of Germany.
yes,
And so, if you look at Bayern, for example, there's a great
yeah,
difference between Bayern and Schleswig-Holstein. We have what is
yeah,
called Jugendweihe, um, and many people choose that instead of the Christian alternative. So we have a
yeah,
few people in the German language chat, and now the question is really, what does that, what we have spoken about, really mean for the corner? What does it mean for the GLC, German language chat, and for the British of Meaning server? It means that I, for example, am one of the only ones or the few ones from the eastern parts of Germany, and I'm only living there because I moved there. It's due to my own biography. And so the biggest part of the people are from the western side, and I think from the middle of Germany, I would say.
yeah. Now the first big difference is that church attendance in Germany is exceedingly low compared to US numbers. even if you take into account the decline of church attendance in the US,
Mm.
they still far excel any number in Germany. And the projections that Gallup and other polls make for the US, we have those numbers already in Germany. And so, what the US society is looking forward to is a development in the next 30 to 50 years that is already actively taking place and occurring right now in the middle of Europe, in a country which Paul Vanderklay described as obviously Christian, which is very interesting because if you look at that, it means architecture in Europe has a history, and the history of these architectural buildings has been either towards God, which are the cathedrals and the domes and the
Mm.
churches, or towards the monarchy, which is the palaces and the castles. So there has always been a move upwards in this architecture, and you can see that in the architecture in Europe and in Germany.
And now
Um,
this is very
and
interesting.
in the US, you don't have any architecture dating further back
When
than the
150
existence
years.
of the United States. So there's like 800 to 1200 years of architectural history lacking, which cannot
Indeed.
show the development of Christianity set in stone as it is possible in Europe.
Yeah,
Basically, what you have in the US is already a Protestantized version of architecture and of aesthetics that is not in any sense comparable to the architectural history of European countries, necessarily.
yes. But there is something coming in here, and that is highly relevant with regards to modern population, modern development within the
Yes,
urban
yes,
landscape. And I would say you can have a situation like in certain Hanseatic towns, and I really mean uh, big towns, not small ones. You can have a certain area which is completely historical and where you have that what you have described, that this is really grown and this is really saturated in Christendom, and then a few hundred meters away from that you can have a certain urban area which is a perfect example for what Roger Scruton called uglification. And I would say
mhm,
this
mhm,
is also another trend, and when you look at it and say um, I come from another place and I visit this town in Germany. Obviously, I'm going to visit the beautiful areas and not the ugly areas. And so,
yes,
in a
I agree.
sense, you block out, you really do not notice what is happening elsewhere. And also, you have this, what is very strange, that is this stronger proclivity to practice, to think in and think alike in Christian practical symbolism, and this symbolism makes them see a great many things that we, as the people who live there, no longer see and no longer take into account. It means that there are what you could call Spuren. There are remains of what has happened from the past that if you were to reconstruct it and trace back the original influences, you would, of course, find that there is Christian stuff behind it, but the awareness of it, not only the propositional awareness, but the explicit awareness, and even the concrete motivation or orientation towards and from it, does not really exist. And so, for that reason, I would say a great many people in Germany are not as Christian as you would like to perceive them when you visit them. I remember, for
Yes,
example, you
yes,
told me, for example, that you were quite shocked after a while when you noticed that we are a Christian household, and if we had visitors, no one would be able to notice it. And that is although you are actively practicing and you are, I think, very devoted. And then you said to yourself and to your family, your wife especially, we should change that and we should
yeah,
make it
yeah,
explicitly visible. And
yeah.
this visibility, that's really it. And there's a
That's
great,
that's 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 indeed is an important point in the sense that Christianity in Germany has been a path of inwardness, not outwardness,
indeed,
since Reformation, and especially the pietistic strain of Reformation.
Yeah.
Um, and that has been hugely successful in German Christianity. And interestingly, we all talk about Luther, but we have to talk about pietism and its consequences.
Mhm.
And this kind of pietism very well goes with, a lack of worldliness, I would say, because
In
if
what
it's all
sense?
reduced
If
to
you
the
go into
inward feelings and exaltations of your inward feelings,
Mhm.
then you can be content with anything that's happening outside of you, um, and that is obviously a different form of faith than, say, actively missionizing strains of Christianity would have.
and that is
And
really
so,
relevant
in a sense,
because
the
if,
privatization of faith has been a part of German Christianity for the last 300 years,
yes, and I
which
would
is
say
which is
for
not as much as you would see in the US. In the US, having a Christian faith is still something very public.
yes, and the
It's
public
it's
aspect is very relevant.
there's a
If you,
perspective there. There's an observation there. There's a publicity there that has been explicitly reduced to a bare minimum in Germany for the last several hundred years.
yes, and this also includes that the people no longer go there. What we all can observe, and Paul Clay observes it in his own church. He says only the old people are the ones who are still coming, and how many young fellows do we still have? And that's an open question. I myself am not a Christian, and so I cannot really speak about that. But I have seen a few of those developments, and I remember, for example, um, the former church where I was going to when I was in my school. We were having just one Gottesdienst and then never again. And just for the introduction into the school, into the beginnings of your school days as a young child. This church is very small. I didn't remember it as that small in the days past, but when I revisited again, almost no people are there, and the building is really lacking in a sense.
Yeah, I mean that is also part of the German landscape. There is this tension between the, um, how you say, exuberant Baroque churches of Southern Catholicism and the
Mm.
minimalist churches of Protestantism in the north.
Oh yes, that's highly relevant, and they are
And and
sometimes
and
very
so
beautiful.
there's
Only
an
on the
aesthetic
landscape.
already involved there.
On the countryside, you can see a great many beautiful churches,
Yeah.
and they are the really interesting ones, not the minimalist Protestant ones that you were speaking of.
Yes. 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 And those are also mostly the churches that are being, you know, set into tourist prospects, and like, okay, this is where you need to go to. This is the place to
Yes,
visit. This is the cathedral, like the Kölner Dom. Uh, um, and the many, especially the many small Baroque churches in Bavaria, um,
yeah.
with altars of Tilman Riemenschneider and all those classical names. It's
Oftentimes
just,
surrounded by a beautiful graveyard, which means there's a lot
yes,
of
yes,
gardening done. And so the
yeah, yeah,
flowers, the plants, they are beautiful and nice to look at, and the stonework, which is the one thing I think Paul Clay notices. And when he says it breathes from the stones, or the stones are living, something like this, no? His own choice.
and basically, if you think about the predominantly visible U.S. architecture, if you think about how do we perceive U.S. architecture, then mostly it's it's glass buildings with lots of glass and steel. And so
Mm,
this is very interesting because basically that's Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier, in a sense, uh, had a pornographic perspective on architecture.
mm,
It's
mm,
what has been guarded and shielded by, small windows, large walls, um,
mm, mm.
beautiful entrances, has now been, the center has been put on the outside. It's like, okay, everything that has been shielded on the inside because it was something special or holy has been uh, opened to a pornographic view, exposed in a way that
Mhm.
everything can be seen from the outside, what's happening on the inside. And so
That
this is the
reminds me
move
of
you
a
can
story.
see from Le Corbusier and Bauhaus. It's like basically everything is glass and steel,
Mm.
and that is um, what Hans Edelmeier talks about when he talks about the loss of a center. Um,
Yes.
you had a reality that included God as an observer, and that necessitated keeping something holy in private.
And
And
there's
with the
something really
loss of,
relevant um, to what
yeah,
you're talking about, and that is the loss in meaning in perception and capability in perception. I had the
yes, yes,
quite recent encounter with my grandmother, and she was talking to me as an old woman of 86 years old. That is, she was always living in the Catholic faith, and so there was the situation that she said it is a scandal that pregnant women could be perceived as dirty or as unrein or as something that is unworthy of partaking in the holy place. And when you look at the churches and when you look at the traditions and the knowledge of it, this particular part that I'm now speaking of has been lost. She didn't know it anymore. And she's 68 years old. When she doesn't know it, who else does know it if he is not really
hmm,
interested in it? And the thing is that you have the altar, and that this is the center where the holy comes in. And when you look at the really old Semitic traditions, and this really goes back more than 2,000 years. And even in the circumstances where the Babylonians were still existing, also to that time. And that they said, we have a high priest, and only the high priest is allowed to enter it, this holy place. Because if you are in that sense uh, dirty or unworthy, this is a rough translation from German, we would have to re-enchant it and would have to reappraise it so that it
yes,
becomes devoted to the one holy being that is our monotheistic God. And this
yeah,
redevotion is something that they should try to evade, and the purpose behind it is very interesting. And the God is something, in a sense, very distant from the living and the dead. And everything that is connected to the living or the dead is, in that sense, a deep something that is able and capable of depurification. And the act of excluding the pregnant woman from the attendance of a church is not with regards to it that she is dirty in the sense of you are like trash, which is what my grandmother would have had in mind when she heard the sentence, oh, you are dirty and you are unrein, and therefore you cannot participate in the Catholic attendance of the church. But she wouldn't realize that she is the bearer of a new life, and for her act of bringing new life into the world, she would be something or someone who is not holy in that sense. The holy is distinct from the living and distinct from the dead. And due to this very, very, very old tradition, she was, or she would have been excluded, or someone would have been excluded as a pregnant woman. And what is now interesting, we still have the words, we still have the propositional form of it, or what I would call the significant form of it, but the meaning has been lost. And when you speak of sin, for example, the people speak of sin in the sense of you have not hit the goal. And what we only hear is
yeah, to
you,
miss the mark. Yeah,
yes, we no longer hear that someone has missed the mark, but sinning is sinning. And sinning means for a great many people of us that we have done something wrong, something to be ashamed of. And that is the first and only meaning that they hear. They no longer listen and hear, you have missed the mark. And when someone who's a Christian or a devoted practicer of any kind of tradition, they speak of sinning. And the only way in which we hear it is, you have to be ashamed of it. They are
mm,
aware, for example, of
mm,
you missed the mark, and the usage of a language has become something so separate from the subjective or the religious practical meaning of it. It has become so very much distinct and even rationalistic, materialistic. We have no perception of it, and a great many things are no
which
longer
just
existing
speaks
ones.
to the success, that the modernization project
Yes,
has had on perception in Europe, as it has influenced the way we speak or
yeah,
the way we attach a significant to a significat.
yeah,
So that also is, I mean, very postmodern. Yeah, you have with Derrida, la différence as a neologism, that he describes to say you cannot say that the apple, the word, is still connected with the apple, the physical object. What you
yes,
can only now say is that the word apple does not signify a tree. It does not signify a car. It's just negation after negation that leads to an infinite regress. And you
yeah,
only what you're left with is the word apple is not car, not tree, not house, not man, not woman, and so on and so forth. And in a sense, what you just described is basically exactly this. You still have the word sin, but it does not point to a conception any longer.
or to the system that is embedded within the biblical text. And this is really relevant because uh, re-enchantment involves re-education. And if you are not educated in that particular kind of thinking, in that particular kind of um, relating one aspect with another, you can get into a postmodern situation, but the postmodern situation is a very late part of the development. I would say it is in a great part a very big lack of education. A great many people no longer learn it. They are no longer growing up. They are no longer going into the community. They are no longer having the education. Even what you get within school is no longer sufficient. And for that reason, the problem is not necessarily that they have been disenchanted by postmodern relativists who say, okay, everything is relative and you can uh, relate things anew. No, the thing is, there is nothing to relate anew there because it hasn't been established for them. They do no longer have a possession of the knowledge. And this lack of knowledge and the need to re educate themselves becomes, I think, obvious with regards to the influence and the impact that people like Peugeot or Peterson have had. And it is what I was a pretty long time talking ago. More than a year ago, we spoke in a German conversation, and I said to you, it is about immanentization, and it is about making something perceptible that has been always there, and they could find it within their own surroundings. And they were surprised that this pragmatic approach works, and they could feel it, they could see it within their own fields and their own domains, within their own surroundings. And when Paul Vanderklay now begins to speak about immanentization, he is, in a sense, 9, 12 months late with regards to what we have had discussed in the German corner. I think he's late.
But that's, I mean, what does that say? It actually just means that there's a there's a there's different speeds or different observations, perceptions about things taking place,
And the
and
likelihood for
there
the
there's
encounter of
yes,
it
exactly
is different.
right. But I mean, those are, you could say, algorithm, you could say, specific hierarchies of people talking about things, and um I don't think you should or you could make a value statement out of that observation. Um, it could have been the case that it might have been noticed earlier, but what does that mean, earlier or later in a conversation that we're having about things that are like stretching millennia of human existence? And we now have this moment where we try to reflect on it. Absolutely right. And I agree, as would many thinkers, I think is pretty obvious that to be able to grasp a conception completely, given that we are living in a world of language, of speech and of text, means that you have to be, in a sense, educated on how to read those texts and how to understand those texts. in a
Even
way
that
that
I
gives
would
you
find
access
interesting.
to the world in a way you haven't had before. As Hans Ruckmacher would say, you only see what you know. And
And
so
again,
if
I
we
think that
if
the
we don't have a
likelihood,
verbalized conception of that, then we cannot see the things. But a big but I would add, language is a pretty late stage of human development. And before that, you already have symbolic transformation in ritualization, in acts of certain types of behavior that in time became connected to a word. And so, in a sense, when we talk about the question whether this is the moment for the Orthodox Church, whether that is the perspective for many young people, um, you do have to acknowledge that it is especially the Orthodox Church that includes acts, symbolizations, symbolic transformations in rituals, in liturgy that are, um, in a sense, without language, and so speak to a more direct contact with reality. And
and this development,
we have
yes,
lost this more immediate contact with reality through hyper rationalization, um, through the act of language. And so I think it is understandable that if you take into account enlightenment and modernization, modernity, that there is this kind of drive to a point beyond language or before language, to come to grips with what created language in the first place, which is the act of symbolic transformation of experiences of reality.
I think there are a great many things that you have said that are relevant and a great many things that can become quite confused. When we speak of us being involved in language and that everything is relational, for example, Peterson speaks about this, Chris speaks about it. A great many people now utter the phrase that reality is relational without taking into account that relational means both one thing because of another, that is the principle of sufficient reason, and the other one relational in the sense of there's something social involved. And that is also interesting. Socius, Latin, means something like the companion, and the
Yes,
companion is the
yes, yes,
neighbor in that sense. And a great many, I would say, phenomena that are worthy of being studied are worthy of being studied because they extend the range of our social companions. Social companions is a tautology, is a pleonasm, but simplest example is really the economic affairs, and the economics are really a domain that is uncomfortable because it doesn't serve our next neighbor. Because it doesn't serve them is one of the reasons that we become alienated with it, and that we need, although we are surrounded by great economic wealth, and we are still empty within. And this emptiness, meanwhile, with the simultaneity of a great wealth of nations, is a fact to remember and to take into account. And a great many people say, oh, we are unable to really live without, and I think this is totally wrong. What we're speaking about is the vitality, and the need for vitality, and the need to really practice and to really immerse oneself in that kind of re-enchanted and re-educated perspective is something that becomes apparent to a great many people due to this conflict and due to the loss of education. And we have at the same time this proclivity of a rationalistic tendencies within the postmodern range, and that they say only that is acceptable or viable even, and that is something strange. Only that is viable of which we can utter propositional statements about the possible effects and their conjunction with our surroundings. I think a great many things have been practiced in the past without anyone being utter the effects, as you mentioned before. Language is something very late in the development, and a great many things, as law, for example, have grown up without ever having been designed, without ever having been understood by the people, even in retrospect, and they only are capable of uttering its importance due to a great many successes within the last 100 or 200 years. I think what we are having
Can I ask you a question on that, or
yes,
maybe just try to reduce it, come to try to catch the essence of what you're trying to tell me? Um, would I be correct, or would it be misleading if I said that you would suggest that part of the project of this little corner should not be in as much focused on pointing towards transcendental practices of liturgy and ritual, but one step before that, already try to open space for a revitalization
I
of
think they
the
should call,
of the immanent aspect of existence.
I would say they should call out the things as they are and classify things correctly. I think they overblow the proportions of things and they attribute a meaning to things that they do not have. And we are in the situation, and that is a great distinction between the American and I would say in part the European, or in this case, German corner. They are so very much focused on the public and the externalization of it that they
Mm.
deem themselves qualified and in the position to involve others and to tell them what the good faith is or what the good is. And the possession of the good and the assumption of being capable to apply this and to use it is really what I would say is something very different. As you were mentioning before, the German.
But is that not actually a necessary aspect of autopoietic systems?
No, it's not necessarily. The question is with regards to the area where the structure becomes more or less manifest. And as you were saying, in the German culture, it has been the case that the relation to the transcendent was inwards, while
Yes,
it was
yes.
outwards with regards to the outward and to the public sphere within the American uh,
Hmm.
perspective. And for that reason, it leads immediately, I would say, to a certain discomfort and to an uneasiness when you watch certain developments within the American sphere from the German point of view, because you see that people become involved and want to change and act upon things that wouldn't be the case within Germany. There is an easiness, there is a likelihood, there is a readiness to intervene
Yeah.
or to act upon things. And in a sense, that is even what the Americans would have called out as self-confidence. Other people would say, and that is really self-confident. And when you look at the distinction between the British and the American kind of humor, it is oftentimes the case that the American is the one who is outward, who's extroverted, who's self-confident, and a British person would find that very rude, would find it very
Mm,
impolite. And that is not due to the
mm.
thing in itself, but it is because the codification of it is different. And our codification tends to the situation that we would say you get involved with things with which we wouldn't even meddle with, usually. This is not the place,
And
this is
so
not
and
the
so
area.
and so, what we find is for a reenchantment, revitalization to take place, that is not um, geocentric in a sense that it's located only in the US American sphere. One would have to focus more on the act of translating what is meant by certain conceptions in the US to the European context and vice versa.
I think the big problem
So
behind it is that
what we are currently lacking is a bridge between those spheres. We do participate in the same online Discord, but that does not mean that we have the same grip on the conceptions.
in a
And
sense, yes.
we have been talking about the same things without thinking whether we actually mean the same things when we talk about
Yeah,
them.
that's true, and
And
it
so
involves
there's
thinking
always been
about
this kind of jump, and we need to build that trust to be able to understand, at least come to terms with the differences of those
it. Mhm.
conceptions, not to make them the same or equalize them or even understand them necessarily, but just to observe and realize that there are possibly very large differences at times. And we've seen those differences in the beginning of a conversation when talking about just pure statistics, church going, church attendance, um, ascribing to religion, yes or no, the nuns, etc. Those are empirical realities that are hugely different. And we've had also this focus on, or the conversation about state church and private church and the privatization of faith. And on the other side, which is quite paradoxical, we have a state church which has led to the privatization of faith, and the US has the opposite. It has private churches that have led to the publication or the publicized version of faith,
Or
uh,
externalization. And I would
the
say
externalization of faith. Yeah,
what this really involves is the fundamental question: what does it mean to help my fellow human beings, or what does it mean to help? And I think
yeah,
in different
yeah.
circumstances and in different areas, cultural areas, for example, the same kind of act, because of the jumps that you were mentioning before, there is not this direct translation of it, or the direct I think Neil gave a good word for that. I'm trying to remember it, but anyhow, it really means that um, the, when you have one side of a river and the other side of a river, and you try to connect the two sides of it, and to get directly from one point to the other is not as easy as the Americans would like to think of it. I think there goes
Mm.
along a certain
Because
potential
they are
for
tectonic
hubris.
plates that are in shift, like these.
Yes,
This
yes,
they are in motion, and so when you start building the bridge, the point where you connect the two sides has already moved. The moment
moved
you actually,
away, and so
yeah,
they do not transition and they do not connect, and
yeah,
the connectivity of it is a problem. And we do have certain ways of engaging, certain ways of being open about it, but what they have oftentimes forgotten is uh, the critique by other people is necessary because you yourself cannot perceive everything, and you have sometimes subjective pre-assumptions and prejudices, and so the critique or the act of criticizing another person is necessary for them to hint towards them that what they perceive as usual or as natural is not natural for another person. And that is one
mm,
of the great, I think, motivations behind this video, because we see a great many things as unusual or find them instinctively, intuitively unusual, while in the connection or in the conversation under American people, they find it very good and find it very pleasant, and they reach a consensus very soon. A consensus that doesn't involve a minority of other people from another standpoint or from another
mm.
point of view. And for that reason, it is necessary for the protection of the minorities, even to speak up and to tell them that what they are thinking, they are doing is not that they are, it doesn't have the impact that they associate with it. And it will not have
So
the
let me stay in that imagery. Um, Given that the sides of the river seem to move and shift for whatever reasons, no need for explaining that. There is a risk of trying to build a steel bridge
mm,
that is not flexible enough to be able to react to this empirical reality. So what
indeed.
you would need is not just thinking about building bridges, but which type of bridge is necessary for the situation we have at hand. And
Yes,
the best bridge I could think of is a pontoon bridge that is swimming, that is floating on the river. And so, what I see in this conversation emerging is um, the observation or the realization that maybe the current way that conversations are taking place, or which way they are heading to, there is a risk of an ossification, of a hardening of
And
the
that's
way we
the word I
the
would put
way
in.
we build those bridges. And we both have intuited that that might be detrimental to the way that we have been able to give space to certain conversations, to certain people, to certain ways of life, which
You
does
could
not mean
also,
that we want to celebrate diversity just for the sake of diversity,
no,
but
no,
but we intuit a danger, maybe, that the cognitive distribution that is the great strength, not the cognitive distribution, the distributed cognition that is the great strength of this little corner of the internet, um, is under the risk of becoming ossified.
of being
And so,
petrified because of reification of the categories and the ideas and the
yes,
relations behind it.
yes,
And
yes.
for example, I do not find it very helpful in this sense, helpful in the sense of overcoming those differences and bridging the differences. We are not going to try and make a new relativism and make a postmodern landscape out of the corner. That's not what we're intending. What we're trying to
No.
say is you're getting too headstrong in one certain direction and you are trying to, you're almost petrifying things. And I do not find it helpful to speak of the good. I do not think it's helpful. I think you assume a common good preemptively, and even before the people are propositionally, explicitly, or even consciously aware of it. What we have, you were speaking of a distributed cognition, of course, but the
Yeah,
necessity
which is why I'm currently focusing more on the aspect of trust.
exactly, and I think this
Because
trust building or the
without us trusting each other, we wouldn't be able to have this open conversation. And we've built trust, and you can build trust. You can also destroy trust. Everyone can speak to that out of their own realities. And interestingly, I've had this chat conversation under the last video of Paul van der Klee with Phoebus, where I said that I think the risk of multi-perspectivalism is that you are not able to translate properly because you are at, at the best having this kind of multitasking. And if you do really want to translate, you have to focus your attention on one language at one time and then translate one conception to the other language. Now, that does not mean that others in this corner cannot have different aspects of a translation or try to translate from different languages into one common language. That is the power of distributed cognition. So I'm not in favor of saying we need to cut down on diversity, but we need to have we need to share the work of translation and distribute the work of translation more, and that also that also includes, before we can actively translate things and communicate them to others, we have to build trust, because I don't know Hayek, I don't know Spengler, I haven't read them, but you have, and we have built a relationship that I trust what you say about Hayek is truthful in a way that Hayek would approve of what you say about him.
to the best of my knowledge, obviously. But
Exactly, and vice versa about Goethe. And if you say, okay, you have a question about Goethe, you trust me what I say about him. Now that means I have to be very careful about what I say, because you do trust me, and you can call me on that. But that
mm,
also means that we have to, we I think maybe we've gone too meta, or maybe not too meta, but too too focused on specifics in those conversations, not just between the German and the English chat, but also within, instead of returning to the roots of what made this corner strong in the first instance, that there's this sense of mutual assured trust for
Yes, and
whatever reason that exists. That was what drew me into this corner and has kept me in it ever since. And it
mm,
might be worthwhile to rekindle that energy,
I agree.
because
And I would
because
say
the other option is an ossification, a reification of the bridges, and they might break down in the long
and
run
that
because
is
of that.
related to what I would call pride or vanity in this connection. We are
Yes,
in
yes,
possession of something that we seem to have accomplished. And I think that is really relevant and interesting with regards to the relation between the immanent and the transcendent. We have always spoken
mm-hmm.
about the difference in how far are psychotechnologies identical with, for example, the possibility to reach the afterlife in Christendom. How far are those things identical? We have a lot of knowledge with regards to the ritualization, the practicalization of it, and I think we are in the dangerous position ever since the last 150 years, almost. I would even say ever since Hegel, because I know the critiques of Kierkegaard with regards to Hegel, and he was of the opinion that great danger is that Christendom became, with Hegel, one story, one narrative, one myth, he said, among others. And now the
Yes,
great danger with Peterson is a return of his critique. And that is that when they say he is a noble pagan, that he is a very good guy, but is he really a Christian? We don't know, we are unsure. He is on the border of things, and the border is a good place for me, he says. That is really related to the possibility of losing out those other qualities of which it is very difficult to speak of. And
yes,
now,
yes,
those things are maybe relevant with regards to the transcendent, and they are not maybe identical with the empirical knowledge. And we have found a great many things of which we are in possession of. And the great critique by Kierkegaard with regards to Hegel is due to the possession of everything, of the knowledge that we have, we become prideful. We are becoming vain because we say, oh, we we doubt everything and that is the right way and the right attitude. And he was always characterizing this at his time. And we are again in the position of repeating the very same mistake from 150 years ago. We haven't become
mm,
more, we aren't really more cleverer. We are not really better educated. We are at the same position. We are doing the same errors and the same pattern is emerging again. What I think is happening right now and what we are talking about is um, overconfidence in the possession of things, and the return to the trust is the antidote to this vain spirit. And I use
yes.
this
I would
word
I would
spirit.
agree.
Yes.
I would agree. I think it's very important what you state there. That returning to trust also includes returning to a humility about the way we use language as a medium of sense making.
And not only
Because what you've
this,
said is that there are intuitions that are difficult to grasp in linguistic conceptions, which makes them difficult to communicate them just by words. And still
yes,
we realize that they exist, even in this corner, even given the fact that we are set apart geographically, technically. Um, and so part of the act of translation is the realization that we are swimming in this, however you want to call it, ether. Yeah. There is, I mean, you could say there's a certain spirit there. And the risk with spirits is if you give them a name, they stick. And
mm,
so this is interesting because it reminds me of a part of our discussion we've had just before, um, of the architecture. Now, I would say that the danger that, I mean, I do have that myself. I love language. I think language is a beautiful medium. I swim in it, especially in German. Um, it can convey beauty, complexity, all those things at the same time. And yet, um, maybe we should grow in the awareness that everything taking place in this little corner hinges on many presuppositions about language, which are not as obvious as we might take them. And so, just taking that step back and think about language itself, about the words we use, about the way we speak, which is not obvious at all. It's a miracle, yeah. And to revere that miracle as such might give us the humility to keep the bridge floating.
Yes, and there's another thing here that I find highly relevant. What we all have to relearn, and I mean our own generation, not necessarily the corner, but part of it is we all remember that, for example, Paul Vanderklay recommends to us to find a church, to go someplace, and to do something. And that
Yes,
is really
yes.
very different from the propositional work of a language work that we are doing here. The language games, Wittgenstein calls them even, are not as sufficient and helpful with regards to a great many things. I think we have reached a point where someone like me can speak with language, use language, and say about the situation that we are in. Language is no longer touching upon the needs of the problems that we have. For the solutions
Hmm.
to emerge, it is sometimes even necessary to stop talking and to act upon it. And what the great danger of the 20th century has been is that people think by working on our language, by redefining the
Yeah,
rules of language, by
yeah.
making the language games more appropriate and to make them more corresponding to the world, more fitting, and
Mm,
everything seems to fit in, and we have a puzzle, and the piece fits here in, and we know it, we have it worked out. This whole building of systems in language and with language is a great mistake. I think it involves that people have gotten to a position where it's more easy and more comfortable to work with language and to use language instead of doing something. And I say this self-critical as I usually am not. Um, Obviously, it's a joke. I am very self-critical. It involves really that we stop talking and do something. And I think the
yeah,
great problem
yeah.
is here that the relation between language and helping is really at stake. And what really happens when we have this great divergence between the bridge and the connectivity of it is, does it even help to talk about it? Is what's the right way to help another person? And what is it? And here, even as a non-Christian, I find it admirable. I find it great what Christ says to one of the people that needed his help. What is it that you want me to do for you?
Yes,
This is a
yes. That's
wonderful statement. I find it absolutely fantastic. Even as a non-Christian,
the
I say that's
autonomy. The
great.
autonomy of the individual is of utmost importance. So much that even though Jesus knew what was obvious, yeah, and what would have been helpful, obviously, to that sick man, he still felt the desire to first ask him and say, "What is it that I should do for you?"
And this involves
Not
because
like, and
it's
so
the
and
right
so
thing to
this is
do.
it. And do I understand you correctly that we run the risk in our language games of becoming a um,
Self-satisfied.
a caricature version of that Jesus, not by asking the question, "What is it that I can do for you?" but basically running in and saying, "I know what's right for you, and I know what I can tell you that will definitely help you, and so let me just, push it onto you."
Yes, and
Which could be very self-conscious. It could be seen as arrogant for whatever
yes,
reasons. There are cultural differences in how we perceive if someone comes to us and says, "I'm here to help you," even though I haven't asked him.
it's a
And
vanity
so people can
vanishing in
feel
its
confronted by
effects,
that.
and it's vain. It's um, it's superfluous. Superfluous. That is the sense of vanity. It's the vanity in the sense of it's a dream what we are working ourselves in, and it's vain in the sense of it's useless. It doesn't help anyone. And I think those
Yes,
multiple
yes.
components of vanity are really highly relevant. Language becomes for a great many people a place to work at and to change things without doing anything and without effectively changing anything within the world. And I'm not a
Mm.
Marxist, but as Karl Marx himself has said, the philosophers have interpreted the world differently, but the right course of action is to change it. And that is really the beginning of a pragmatic change in social scientists and the perspective on the world. And now with a language, no, with a what was it called? With a start of the language turn, the linguistic turn. That's it. The linguistic turn. We have tossed this aside and became, in a sense, autonomous, but autonomous in the sense of I can present myself to you, whatever I um, look like for you, that is what I want, and that is self sufficient. And language games are no longer the solution. A great many discussions about our politics nowadays could be solved and could be easily um, made accessible if we realized that changing our language doesn't change the things that are
Yes,
problematic.
yes, absolutely. I totally agree with you that um, there's a real danger, and that has been propelled also by postmodern approaches, is
Exactly.
to say that, especially constructivism,
Yes.
the notion that speech itself defines reality
Or creates even.
or creates reality and recreates it. And so by speaking something, I already bring something into existence. And that is, in a sense, it's post-idealism. It's like my pure will. I have the will that something exists. I give words to it. And because I've given words to it, now it must exist. And so I treat reality as if I had had the possibility to actually create that reality without realizing that reality doesn't care about my language.
There's magical thinking in the psychological sense
Yes, yes,
definition. When
yes,
Peterson speaks about Marduk, he says he has this head and this is surrounded by certain symbols, and then he speaks magical words and things come into existence. The
yeah.
thing is about language and its relation to, I like the word influentiality better than reality because I speak of changes in causal effects, and therefore I prefer to use this neologism instead of reality. The English language
Mhm.
is terrible with that, and the German language is much better because we have the word Wirklichkeit, and there is the
Yeah,
causation in
yeah,
it. And
yeah.
in reality, everything is real that is real, more real than real. It's terrible. And you always lose out because you don't have this distinction and the difference between, for example, how does language relate to, yes, and that's the problem, reality. Influentiality, what does it affect? What does it change? What is it that happens within the world if we use that word instead of another one? And how
Mhm.
does it relate to the material surroundings, even to what we can look at, what we can touch and interact with? And I can speak a lot of things, but my desk still remains messy. I should still have to tidy up my room, and I can talk hours and hours, and I feel better
Oh,
after.
this is an astute observation that I can relate to.
Everyone has
Many
that.
a conversation in this little corner of the internet. I've been baffled by the fact that the people talking about Peterson and high floating concepts do not, in the singlest, smallest amount, take any care about the frame they put the video in, about the background. It's all messy and not in an orderly fashion. So there's an orderliness in here, but it's not outside of them. And so, indeed, for many of us, just the realization that Peterson says, clean up your room, made us feel good. But in many cases, that has not had any influence on our reality right in front of our noses.
Indeed,
And
indeed.
so we have to
It has become
cut
detached.
back. We have to cut back on these language games in a
Yes,
sense and really try to get to the gist of it. Is what is it in my everyday life right here in front of me that should change or has changed because of my interactions in this little corner of the internet? and what is it that
What would
I
you
want
getting
to give as an offer, not push it onto someone, but what are the offerings that we can give to lay them on the table without saying you have to eat of this fruit, because
maybe
if
it's
you do
made for
not eat of
sacrifice?
this fruit,
Yes.
yeah. So I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and we've just begun to scratch the surface. But I feel that we've had quite a few insights already that uh, would make it necessary to re-listen to and rethink them, work them through, uh, and then come back to another conversation about this, because I feel that this leads to something. It
Mm.
helps me, clarify my thoughts on this, and it's given me the space to voice some of the concerns that I've had, uh, and give words to them, for lack of another medium.
Mm.
Uh, but I still think that we can still cover more ground to be able to maybe generate something, yeah, beneficial out of it. I wouldn't say that this has not been beneficial to me, but at the end of the day, I would feel uh, more hopeful if I were able to create something that is beneficial to others as well. I think you see that in the same way.
I think I agree. And there is something that you have once said, and that is to be a shining and possibly guiding light for others. Today we had another role, and that is what Socrates said about himself, that he is a wasp. And if we have caused a sting and some itches, that people can scratch those itches on themselves or on their own. They don't need ourselves anymore. They can continue the conversation. And if they do, they can also continue to not change the world and further feel the itches. Maybe
Yes.
that is something.
So
Sometimes
this
getting
so
people
maybe this is part
uncomfortable,
one. Yeah.
yeah, getting people uncomfortable is the first step for healing.
So this has been part one, the itch. The next part will be the ointment. See
Oh
you then.
man,
until next time.
bye bye.
Bye bye.